The encounter. David Mitchell had always considered himself a man of action, a man who could navigate the complexities of life with the precision of a well-crafted business plan. He had built his empire from the ground up, maneuvering through every challenge and obstacle with the ease of someone who had learned to bend the world to his will. Every aspect of his life, from his sleek, modern mansion on the hill to his top-of-the-line SUV, was a testament to the power of hard work, relentless ambition, and, of course, wealth. There was no problem that money couldn't solve, no challenge too big that it couldn't be conquered with enough resources at his disposal. So when the flat tire hit him, David was less than thrilled. It was a warm afternoon in the middle of July, the kind of heat that seemed to crawl into your bones and make even the simplest of tasks feel like insurmountable challenges. David was driving down a long rural highway just outside of the city. He had a business meeting scheduled in less than an hour, an important one with potential investors who could take his company to the next level. He was running behind, but he thought he could make it with a few minutes to spare. That is, until the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of a flat tire sounded from beneath the car. Of course, David muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He pulled over to the side of the road, his luxury vehicle kicking up a cloud of dust as he came to a halt. The road ahead stretched out in a desolate, empty expanse, the only movement coming from the occasional gust of wind stirring the tall grass that bordered the road. With no one in sight, David knew he would have to handle this himself. The heat of the day immediately hit him as soon as he stepped out of the SUV, the air thick and suffocating. He adjusted his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and made his way to the back of the vehicle. The tire was shredded, the rubber peeling away in jagged strips. David kneeled beside it, his brow furrowing as he inspected the damage. He reached for his phone and tried dialing for roadside assistance, but of course there was no signal. He cursed under his breath and slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. This was not the kind of thing he was used to dealing with. In his world, a flat tire was something that someone else took care of, a member of his team, a chauffeur, or a roadside service crew. But here, out in the middle of nowhere, he was stranded with no help in sight. His options were slim. David had never had to change a tire himself. He had no idea where to even begin. He sat back on his heels, staring at the car, feeling the weight of his helplessness settle on his shoulders. As he sat there, his mind wandered back to a time in his youth when he had been in a similar situation. He had been a young man, no more than 18 or 19, stranded on the side of a road in a rundown part of town. He remembered the looks he had gotten from people passing by, those who had seen him in need but had turned away without a second thought. He remembered the sting of that indifference, the cold, dismissive glances that made him feel invisible. It was moments like those that had solidified his belief that you couldn't rely on anyone. You had to do everything yourself. Dependence was a weakness, and David Mitchell had never been weak. Shaking his head, he shoved the memory aside, trying to refocus on the task at hand. But before he could begin searching for any kind of solution, he noticed something, or rather, someone, moving towards him from the horizon. At first, it was nothing more than a blur in the distance, but as the figure drew closer, it became clearer. A young boy, no older than 14, was walking toward him down the deserted road. He wore a faded t-shirt and a pair of old sneakers, his steps purposeful and confident. David straightened up and watched as the boy got closer, wondering if he was imagining things. The boy stopped a few feet away from the SUV, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Hey, mister, you got trouble with your car?" His voice was clear, but there was an underlying tone of concern, as if he had seen someone in need and felt compelled to help. David hesitated, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to interacting with strangers, especially not kids. "Yeah, flat tire," he said, keeping his voice level, though his frustration was evident. "I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy glanced down at the shredded tire, then back up at David with a calm, almost knowing expression. "I can help with that. My dad showed me how to do it." David blinked in surprise. You can change a tire." The boy nodded confidently, taking a few steps closer. "Yeah, no big deal. The spare is usually in the back, right?" He didn't wait for David to respond before heading around to the rear of the vehicle. David stood there for a moment, dumbfounded, watching the boy move toward the hatchback. It wasn't that David was incapable of recognizing a good deed. It was more that he had become so accustomed to a life where every favor had a price, where every action came with an unspoken agreement of compensation. People didn't just help others without expecting something in return. But this boy, this stranger, was offering his help without hesitation, without the expectation of a reward. The boy opened the hatchback of the SUV and started rummaging through the trunk, pulling out a tire iron and a spare tire without a second thought. His movements were swift and sure, and before David could even fully comprehend what was happening, the boy was on his knees beside the tire, loosening the lug nuts with practiced precision. David watched, a strange mixture of relief and skepticism churning in his chest. "You're really doing this?" he asked, more to himself than to the boy. The whole situation felt surreal. The boy didn't respond immediately, but worked diligently, his hand steady as he maneuvered the wrench with ease. After a few moments, the boy glanced up, noticing David's distant expression. "You okay, mister? You're looking kind of pale." David cleared his throat and straightened up, brushing off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though the words didn't sound entirely convincing. "Just not used to this kind of thing." The boy smiled again, that same simple, genuine smile. "It's no problem. You just gotta know where to look and how to get your hands dirty, that's all." David couldn't help but admire the boy's self-assuredness. There was something so effortlessly confident about him, something that David himself had never really learned to embrace. David stayed quiet as the boy finished securing the spare tire, tightening the bolts with the same rhythmic motion he had used when loosening them. Within moments, the tire was changed, the job completed. The boy stood up, brushing the dust off his knees. "All done," the boy said, stepping back and giving David a thumbs up. "You're good to go." David stood there for a moment, stunned. It had all happened so quickly. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the situation. I really appreciate it," he said, pulling out his wallet and reaching for a few bills. He held them out to the boy. "Here, for your trouble." But the boy just shook his head, his smile never fading. "Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help." Without another word, he turned and started walking back down the road, his steps light, as though helping was the most natural thing in the world. David stood frozen, the money still in his hand, watching the boy disappear into the distance. His mind was a whirl of confusion. Why had the boy refused the money? Why had he helped without asking for anything in return? It didn't make sense. Nothing in David's life made sense anymore. He felt a deep sense of unease settle in his chest. The boy's words, "just wanted to help," echoed in his mind as he climbed back into his SUV and started the engine. David glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the boy's figure grow smaller and smaller as the distance between them widened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him, something he didn't fully understand, but that was undeniably real. As the road stretched ahead of him, David couldn't help but wonder, what had he just experienced? And what did it mean for him? Someone who had spent his entire life navigating the world with the expectation of return, with the certainty that nothing came without a price. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in a long while, he realized he didn't need one. Not yet, at least. David drove on, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the road ahead. The neighborhood he called home was still miles away, but for the first time, the journey felt different. The stranger in the rearview mirror. David's day had begun like any other, his mind consumed by the usual clutter of meetings, phone calls, and business deals. Yet, in the back of his mind, a single thought lingered: the encounter with the boy. That fleeting moment on the side of the road, where the boy had come out of nowhere, offering help without hesitation, had unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully understand. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, David found himself lost in thought while driving, his focus wavering from the road ahead. He usually prided himself on his precision, on how every part of his life ran with mechanical perfection. Yet something about the simplicity of that encounter had stirred something deeper within him, an emotion he had long buried under the weight of wealth and success. His luxury SUV glided along the narrow, winding road, its tires humming softly against the asphalt. The landscape stretched out before him. Endless stretches of cornfields, rolling hills on the horizon, and the occasional farmhouse dotting the scenery. It was beautiful in a way that felt out of reach for him, as if he were merely a visitor in this quieter, more humble world. He found it peaceful, too peaceful. That thought brought him back to the boy, Lucas. The last thing David had expected that morning was to be rescued by a kid, someone so far removed from the world he inhabited. A deep sigh escaped David's lips. The more he tried to shove the feeling away, the more it clung to him, a sense of vulnerability he wasn't used to. He was used to being the one who called the shots, who helped others. But here was a boy who hadn't asked for anything in return, a boy who gave without hesitation, who acted out of kindness, not obligation. David couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something like that for him, not without expecting something in return. The air was thick with heat, and the sound of the tires against the road grew louder as David pushed his foot down on the accelerator. He had an important meeting in an hour, a deal that could make or break the company. But all he could think about was the boy, the way his hands had moved so effortlessly as he changed the tire, the quiet confidence in his voice. David felt a gnawing feeling in his gut, a sense that something important had happened in that brief moment, something he couldn't quite grasp. But it was just a flat tire. That's all it was. Right. He pushed those thoughts aside and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to focus on the task at hand. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered it without thinking. It was Clara, his wife, calling to check in. She knew him well enough to sense when something was off, even from a simple phone call. "David, you're being quiet today. You okay?" Clara's voice was soft, but it carried a tone of concern. "I'm fine," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Just a little distracted." Clara was silent for a moment, and David could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She was perceptive, much more than he gave her credit for. Finally, she spoke again. "You sure? You've been off since you got back from your meeting yesterday. You didn't tell me everything that happened out there, did you?" David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He knew she was right. He hadn't told her about the boy. He hadn't told anyone. It felt insignificant in the grand scheme of things, like a fleeting moment that didn't deserve attention. And yet, the more he tried to push it out of his mind, the more it refused to leave. "Just work stuff, I guess," he muttered, trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters. "It's been a long day, but I'm fine. You know how it is." Clara didn't press him further, but David could sense the lingering doubt in her silence. It was something they had learned over the years. She could tell when he was hiding something. But it wasn't the right time, he told himself. Not now, not when he had a deal to close and everything depended on him being at his best. After a few more moments of small talk, they hung up, and David let the phone slip back into his pocket. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. He had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize, to keep his personal life separate from his work. But there was something about this encounter that didn't fit neatly into any box. It wasn't just about a flat tire. It wasn't about the boy. It was something else, something deeper. David shook his head, as if to clear the confusion clouding his thoughts. He couldn't afford to dwell on this. Not today. By the time David arrived at the office, the nagging feeling still clung to him, despite his best efforts to shake it off. The air inside the office was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the humid air outside. As he walked through the lobby, his assistant greeted him with a smile, but even her presence couldn't dispel the odd sensation creeping up on him. He moved through the day mechanically, meeting after meeting, presentation after presentation. The numbers and figures blurred together, and David found himself barely paying attention. He glanced at his watch. Only an hour to go before he could return home, but the thought of sitting in his empty house, surrounded by the polished luxury he had spent so much of his life acquiring, made his chest tighten. The home he had built, brick by brick, wasn't the sanctuary it should have been. He could hear the voices of his children in his mind, their chatter around the dinner table. Ellie, his teenage daughter, was probably lost in her phone, while Josh, his younger son, would be eager to share the latest school project he'd been working on. But David knew it wasn't enough. None of it was enough anymore. He hadn't been fully present in years, not with Clara, not with his children. He had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that he had lost sight of what mattered. He had pushed everyone and everything aside in the name of success. It had cost him more than he cared to admit. He could no longer ignore the fact that his life felt hollow. The luxury, the power, the accolades, they all felt meaningless in the face of the boy's simple act of kindness. By the time David left the office that evening, the decision had already been made. He would go back to where the boy had helped him, back to that stretch of country road. He had to see him again. He didn't know why, but the urgency was overwhelming. The following morning, David woke early, driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He skipped his usual routine of suits and ties, opting for something simpler, a pair of jeans, a casual shirt. He was going to find the boy. He needed to understand. Clara was in the kitchen when he left, preparing breakfast for the kids. David paused at the doorway, glancing at her. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. But he didn't speak. He just nodded and stepped out the door, leaving the house behind him. The drive was long, but he was determined. His mind raced with questions. Why had the boy helped him? What had made him so willing to give, to do something so selfless without expecting anything in return? As he drove, the landscape blurred past him. The road was familiar, but David felt a strange sense of unfamiliarity, as though the world had shifted in some way, and he hadn't noticed it until now. The closer he got to the spot where the tire had gone flat, the more nervous he became. He didn't know what to expect. Would the boy be there? Would he even remember David? Finally, he reached the place. The familiar stretch of road, the empty horizon, the farmhouse in the distance. He pulled the SUV over to the side and stepped out, scanning the area for any sign of the boy. He stood there for a moment, the heat of the morning sun pressing against him. The world was still, and then in the distance, he saw it, a small house, modest but well kept. His heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? David started walking toward the house, each step heavier than the last. He didn't know why he was doing this, but something told him it was important. A place to belong. David stood at the edge of the dirt path that led to the small house, his shoes sinking slightly into the loose earth beneath him. His heart beat louder now, a rapid drum in his chest. He hadn't expected to feel this nervous, this uncertain, walking up to someone else's home. His life had always been defined by certainty, deals, schedules, timetables. But now, with every step he took, the weight of his own uncertainty felt heavier. The house ahead was simple, with peeling white paint and an unkempt front yard. But there was something welcoming about it, something grounded. It looked real, not polished or curated like the spaces he inhabited. There were no manicured lawns, no security gates, no high-end landscaping. Instead, there were a few old bikes leaning against the porch, a rusted mailbox, and flower beds that seemed to grow wild with life. It wasn't perfect, but there was a warmth to it, a sense of life, of history, of family. It was the kind of place David had left behind a long time ago. He took a deep breath and approached the front door, the heat of the morning sun pressing against his skin. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel like he was out of place. What was he even doing here? The question gnawed at him, but it was drowned out by another thought. What if he was wrong? What if this wasn't the right house? What if he couldn't find the boy? Or worse, what if he found him and the boy didn't want to be found? Before he could talk himself out of it, David reached the door. His knuckles hesitated just above the old wooden surface, but then he knocked, the sound sharp in the still morning air. A moment passed before the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her face lined with age, but soft with warmth. She was dressed in simple clothes, faded denim and a faded floral blouse. Her hair was pulled back loosely, revealing eyes that held a quiet strength. David felt immediately out of place in his crisp, expensive clothes, standing in front of someone who seemed to have so much less, but somehow had so much more. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cautious but not unkind. She studied him for a moment, clearly taken aback by his appearance. It wasn't every day someone like him showed up at her doorstep, and David could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. David cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm looking for a boy. His name's Lucas. He helped me yesterday with my car, changed a flat tire for me. I wanted to thank him." At the mention of Lucas's name, the woman's expression softened. She stepped back from the door, her eyes shifting behind her to where a boy's laughter echoed from somewhere inside the house. Then she looked back at David, her face now open with recognition. "You mean Lucas," she said with a small nod, as if she'd expected this moment. "Come on in. He'll be right out." David hesitated. He wasn't used to being invited into homes like this, homes that were lived in, where the walls weren't lined with accolades or trophies. There was no need for him to prove anything here. The house was humble, worn, but full of life. It was different from his own, but something in her eyes told him this was where he needed to be. As he stepped over the threshold, he noticed the small details. The faded family photos on the walls, a stack of books by the couch, an old but well-used kitchen table covered with papers, and a half-finished crossword puzzle. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something else, a warmth that felt foreign, like home. The woman motioned for him to sit. "Lucas," she called, her voice warm yet firm. "Come here, please." David stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, unsure of what to do. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing around the room as if he were trying to decipher the life that had been built here. The space felt different from his own, as if it had meaning beyond the things inside it. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway, soft at first, then louder, and before long, Lucas appeared in the doorway. The boy's smile was wide and genuine, his eyes alight with recognition. When he saw David, his face broke into that familiar, confident grin. "Mister," he said with a chuckle, "you actually came back." David felt a strange knot twist in his stomach at the sight of Lucas. The kid was so unaffected, so natural. The simplicity of his gesture, of offering help without even a second thought, made David feel like an outsider. He couldn't help but admire it. "Yeah, I came back," David replied, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. He cleared his throat. "I'd wanted to thank you properly. For what you did for me yesterday. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." Lucas shrugged nonchalantly. "It wasn't a big deal, mister. Just a flat tire. I help people when I can." His words were so casual, as if helping others was just what you did. No questions asked, no rewards expected. David didn't know how to respond. The boy's humility hit him like a punch to the gut. It made him uncomfortable, as if his entire life, his career, his wealth, his way of thinking, was being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, right in front of him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done something without expecting something in return. David found himself suddenly unsure of what to say. "I wanted to do something for you," he said, finally finding his voice. Your mom. You. I don't know. I just feel like I owe you something. I can't. I can't just walk away after you did something like that for me. Lucas glanced at his mother, who was standing by the kitchen counter, watching them with a patient smile. She nodded encouragingly, as if she knew exactly how this moment would unfold. David continued, his words faltering. I don't even know what to offer, but I want to do something. I can't just forget about this. Lucas tilted his head, considering the offer. His gaze flickered toward his mother again, who gave him a subtle nod. Well, he said slowly, his eyes thoughtful. Maybe there is something you can do, but it's not what you think. David leaned in, eager for any answer, any way to repay the boy. What is it? He asked, his voice full of curiosity. Lucas looked up at him, his smile softening as he met David's eyes. Come in, stay for breakfast. We don't have much, but it'd be nice to have you here. David blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the offer. Here was a boy who had so little, yet all he wanted in return for helping a complete stranger was companionship. It was almost too much for David to process. Before he could respond, Lucas's mother, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. We may not have much, but we have a lot of heart, she said gently. You're welcome to stay, Mr. Westbrook. It's the least we can do. David stood there, his mind reeling. The offer was simple, almost absurd, yet it was exactly what he needed. He realized then that there was something he was looking for, something that had eluded him for years. And maybe, just maybe, this family had it. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. All right, David said softly, a lump forming in his throat. I'd like that. I'd really like that. The boy's grin widened, and he led David toward the kitchen, where breakfast was already being prepared. As they sat down at the table, David couldn't help but notice how warm it felt, how natural. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of his wealth, not because of his title, but because he was being seen for who he truly was. No pretenses, no walls. Just a man, a family, and a meal shared in kindness. And in that moment, David knew that everything had changed. The simple gift of presence. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen windows, casting warm, golden light on the small table where David sat. The air smelled of fresh coffee, scrambled eggs, and the earthy sweetness of homemade bread, all blending together into a quiet symphony of comfort. It was simple, so simple. And yet, it felt like something David had long forgotten. As Lucas's mom moved around the kitchen, preparing a modest but hearty breakfast, David took in his surroundings. The room was cozy but worn. The walls were painted in soft pastel shades, and the floorboards creaked underfoot with the weight of time. The table was mismatched, a collection of chairs from different eras, each with its own story. A faded lace tablecloth covered the surface, and the shelves were lined with jars of preserved fruits, herbs, and books on gardening and old recipes. Everything in the house seemed to reflect the same warmth and simplicity. Functional, lived in, and full of love. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to being in a space like this, so honest, so unpretentious. Every inch of his own home, every room, was meticulously curated, an extension of his success, a place designed for impressing and inspiring. Yet now, surrounded by this warmth, he felt like an outsider in his own skin. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, from the people he interacted with to the way his world appeared to others. But here, in this small kitchen with this unassuming family, he realized how little control he had over his own sense of fulfillment. Lucas's mom, whose name David had learned was Grace, placed a plate of steaming scrambled eggs and freshly baked toast in front of him. The food was simple, but the way she had prepared it, with care and a certain quiet pride, made it feel special. Grace smiled warmly at him. I know it's not much, but I hope you enjoy it. It's the best we have. David nodded, his throat tight. It looks perfect, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The eggs were soft, fluffy, and tasted like home, like something made with love and attention. It was so different from the cold, flavorless meals he had grown used to eating in his high-rise apartment or at the endless business meetings he attended. There, food was just fuel, something to get through so he could move on to the next task. But here, it was an offering. It was nourishment, not just for the body, but for the soul. Lucas sat across from him, a glass of orange juice in hand, watching him with quiet curiosity. There was an energy in the boy's eyes, a kind of innocent optimism that David had lost somewhere along the way. He felt both humbled and awed by it, as if Lucas held some secret to life that he had forgotten to look for. "So, Mr. Westbrook," Lucas said, his tone light, breaking the silence, "what's it like to have everything?" David paused mid-bite, the question catching him off guard. It was a question he had never asked himself, not in those terms. Sure, he had often wondered what it would be like if he had more money, more success, more recognition, but no one had ever asked him what it was like to have it all. It was an unsettling question, one that made him rethink everything he thought he knew. He set his fork down slowly, looking at Lucas with a new kind of understanding. "It's not as easy as people think," David admitted, his voice quieter now. "People see the cars, the big house, the meetings, and they think it's perfect. They think I have it all figured out. But I don't. It's not as glamorous as it seems. It's lonely sometimes." Lucas's eyes widened slightly, and he looked at David as if trying to understand. "Lonely," he repeated, as if the word itself was foreign to him. David nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like everything is transactional. People only want to be around you because of what you can do for them or what they can get from you. You forget what it's like to just be with people, just to be human without any expectation. I'm surrounded by all this stuff, but sometimes I feel more alone than ever." The words had come out before he even realized it, unburdening something he had been carrying for a long time. It was like a weight had lifted off his shoulders, but the vulnerability of it left him exposed. He glanced at Lucas, who was still staring at him with that innocent curiosity, and he felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. In this moment with this boy, he didn't have to be someone important. He could just be David. Lucas was quiet for a moment, considering what David had said. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, he shrugged and smiled. "Well, I guess that's why it's good to help people, right? Because you don't need anything in return. You're just helping." David blinked, struck by the simplicity of the boy's words. It was such a stark contrast to everything he had ever known. In Lucas's world, kindness wasn't a currency. It wasn't a tool to get something in return. It was a gift, pure and simple. "I don't think I've ever really thought about it that way," David said, his voice soft. He felt like the boy had just opened a door to something he hadn't realized he was missing. A sense of meaning, a sense of connection, and it wasn't something that could be bought or sold. It was something you gave because it made life richer. Lucas nodded thoughtfully, as if it all made perfect sense to him. He reached for his juice, took a sip, and then added, "My mom always says that the best things in life aren't the things you buy. It's the people you help, the way you make someone else feel better. That's what matters most." David glanced at Grace, who was still moving around the kitchen, quietly tidying up. He had to admit, there was something different about her too. She wasn't frazzled or distracted like so many people he knew. She didn't seem to be chasing after the next big thing, the next deal, or the next opportunity. She was just present. She was here, now, in this moment, and somehow her calm made everything else feel less important. The weight of David's own life, all the pressures and the demands, began to feel distant. It wasn't that he had to abandon everything he'd built, but maybe it was time to rethink what really mattered. What if it wasn't the million-dollar deals or the status symbols that defined his life? What if it was the moments like this? Moments of connection, of shared humanity, of simply being present with someone else without any hidden agenda. For the first time in a long time, David felt something shift inside him. It was a quiet, subtle shift, but it was there. He wasn't sure what it meant or where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. There was something about Lucas, about Grace, about this family, that had unlocked something in him. It was as if the boy's kindness, his simplicity, had sparked a light in David that he had forgotten was there. And in that moment, sitting in this modest kitchen with these humble people, David realized that he had been chasing the wrong things for a long time. Lucas looked at him, his eyes still full of that innocent curiosity, but there was something else there now. Something more mature, something that suggested he understood more about the world than his years would indicate. "So, Mr. Westbrook," Lucas said with a sly grin, his voice light, "you going to keep driving your fancy car around all the time? Or you think you might slow down a little? Maybe help someone else for no reason?" David chuckled softly, the laughter escaping him before he could stop it. It felt good to laugh, to let go of the tension that had gripped him for so long. "I think," he said, a smile tugging at his lips, "I think I might start looking for more reasons to help." Lucas gave a triumphant nod, as if he had won some kind of silent victory. "Well, that's all I'm asking," he said with a wink. "One good deed at a time." As the meal finished, David felt something inside him stir, a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe he didn't need to have all the answers, all the control. Maybe what he needed was to be part of something bigger than himself, to be present in the lives of others, and to give without expectation. For the first time in a long time, David didn't feel like he was running toward something. Instead, he felt like he was finally beginning to understand what it meant to truly stop, to breathe, to be. And as he left the small house that morning, with the warmth of the meal and the kindness of the boy and his mother still lingering in his heart, David knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same man who had pulled over to the side of the road just a day ago. And whatever came next, he was ready to face it, not alone, but with others. The people who mattered most. The ripple effect of change. Days turned into weeks, and David's world continued to shift in ways he couldn't have imagined. He no longer spent his mornings in board meetings or rushing from one deal to the next. Instead, he spent his time helping at the community center, assisting Grace with her outreach programs, and volunteering his skills where they were needed most. It was a far cry from the world of high-stakes negotiations he had once inhabited, but every day felt more fulfilling than the last. The first time he volunteered at the food pantry, he was taken aback by the gratitude of the people he met. The elderly woman who couldn't speak English but smiled every time he handed her a package of food. The young father who was just trying to make ends meet for his kids. The teenagers who had no idea where their next meal would come from but still managed to share jokes with each other. These were the people David had never truly seen before, the people who lived in the shadows of society, whose voices were too often drowned out by the noise of ambition, wealth, and power. One afternoon, as David was stocking shelves, he was approached by a middle-aged man named Sam, who had been a regular at the pantry for years. Sam's face was weathered, his hands rough from years of manual labor. He wasn't the type to ask for help, but when he spoke to David, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that David had learned to recognize. "You're not from around here, are you?" Sam asked, leaning against the counter. David smiled softly. "No, I guess I'm not," he replied. "I've been around for a while now, but I'm still getting used to things." Sam nodded, his eyes narrowing as he observed David. "I can tell. You've got that look about you, like you're still trying to figure out what really matters." David paused, surprised by the man's insight. "I'm learning," he said quietly. "I think I'm finally starting to understand." Sam didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over at the small group of people gathered around a table, some of them chatting, others eating their meals. His voice softened as he spoke again. "It's easy to get lost in the grind, to think that life is all about what you can get. But when you spend your whole life chasing things, you miss out on the good stuff. You miss out on the people who need you, the connections that make it all worth it. We don't have much here, but we have each other. That counts for something. David's heart stirred as he listened to Sam's words. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just helping out in the community, he was learning from it. He was finding meaning in the small acts of kindness that permeated every corner of the neighborhood. That evening, as David sat on the porch of Grace and Lucas's house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on how far he had come. He had left behind the trappings of success, the shiny facades of the city, and had found something far more valuable. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the temptation to return to his old life was overwhelming. The world he had walked away from still called to him, still held its promises of power and prestige. But each time he felt that pull, he reminded himself of the warmth in Grace's smile, the laughter in Lucas's eyes, the gratitude in the people he helped each day. This new life wasn't about material wealth or accolades. It was about connection, about being present for the people who mattered. And that was worth more than anything David had ever achieved in his past. As the months passed, David began to notice something remarkable. The changes he had made in his own life were starting to ripple out, touching the lives of others. People in the community began to open up to him, to share their own stories of struggle and triumph. They saw in him someone who understood, someone who had walked a similar path and was now walking beside them. It wasn't just about him giving back. It was about creating a space where others could do the same. One evening, as David helped organize a community event at the center, a woman named Maria approached him. She had recently moved into the neighborhood with her young son after escaping an abusive relationship. Her hands were rough from working 2 jobs, and her face bore the signs of exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything you've done here. I've never felt like I belonged anywhere. But here, I feel like I have a chance." David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We're all in this together. You belong here, just like everyone else." Maria nodded, wiping a tear from her eye before smiling through it. "You don't know what that means," she said quietly. "You don't know how much it means to hear that." That was when David realized the true impact of his journey. It wasn't about grand gestures or lofty ideals. It was about showing up for people, about reminding them of their worth, about creating spaces where they could find hope, strength, and a sense of belonging. The change he had experienced in his own life was now becoming a force that rippled out, touching the lives of others in ways he hadn't expected. And then, one day, David received a call. It was from his old assistant, Sarah, who had been with him through many of his years in the corporate world. "David," she said, her voice uncertain, "I don't know if this is the right time, but I've been thinking a lot about my own life lately, about what really matters. And I wanted to ask, how do I start over? How do I make the kind of change you've made?" David paused, the weight of her question sinking in. He could hear the longing in her voice, the same longing he had felt when he first realized that his life needed to change. "Well," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I think it starts with being honest with yourself. Asking what you truly want, not what others expect from you. And then taking that first step, no matter how small it may seem. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. It's about finding the courage to let go of what doesn't serve you and embracing the things that matter." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Sarah spoke again. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you." David smiled, a warmth spreading through him as he realized the full scope of what was happening. His transformation, which had started as a small shift in his own life, was now becoming a beacon for others. The ripples of change were growing wider, touching more lives, and creating a community of people who were ready to embrace their own journeys. And so, with every step he took, David was reminded that change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, steady process, like the growth of a seed into a tree. But with every new connection, every act of kindness, every story shared, he could see the truth. The ultimate change, the one that truly mattered, was the change within. And that change was far more powerful than anything he had ever imagined. David was no longer just a man who had left behind the trappings of wealth. He was someone who had found his purpose in life, not in what he had, but in who he was becoming. And as that purpose spread through the people around him, he realized that it wasn't just his life that was changing. It was the world he lived in, one small act at a time. The uncharted path. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small, meaningful moments. The rhythm of David's life had shifted in a way that was both comforting and, at times, unnerving. He found himself spending more time at the community center, organizing charity drives, and meeting with local business owners to discuss ways they could give back to the neighborhood. It was the first time in his life that he truly felt like he was part of something larger than himself, a place where his contributions, no matter how small, mattered. Yet there was still something that lingered beneath the surface, a question that gnawed at him. Was this really who he was now? Despite the quiet satisfaction he found in helping the community, David couldn't ignore the old habits, the whispers of ambition that occasionally surfaced in his mind. Sometimes, late at night, as he sat in his study looking out the window at the stars, he would wonder if he had left too much behind. If, in pursuing this new path of humility and service, he had somehow lost the part of himself that had once been so driven, so ambitious. It was a question he didn't have an answer to yet, but David knew this. He wasn't the same person he had been before he met Lucas and Grace. The old David, the one who measured success by his wealth and the status it brought him, felt more like a stranger to him with each passing day. One morning, David received a call that would alter the course of his journey yet again. It was from Michael, the former colleague he hadn't heard from in months. The call came just as David was finishing up his meeting with the school principal about a new mentorship program. The conversation had gone well, and David was feeling hopeful about the future. But Michael's voice on the other end of the line sent a wave of uncertainty through him. "David," Michael's voice was thick with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot about the last few months. I've been looking at things differently. I know we've always been focused on the same goals. Making money, building the business, climbing the ladder. But I don't know anymore. I've been talking to a lot of people, and it feels like I've been chasing something that doesn't matter." David leaned back in his chair, surprised by the tone in Michael's voice. For years, Michael had been the embodiment of ambition. If anyone understood the world of high-stakes business, it was him. "What do you mean, Michael?" David asked, his voice careful, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I mean," Michael continued, "I think I've been living in a bubble of success and status, where everything is a transaction. But when I look at my life, it feels hollow. I'm not happy. I'm not fulfilled. And I'm not sure how to change it." There was a pause, then Michael added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm not sure where to start." David felt a pang of empathy in his chest. He recognized the same restlessness in Michael that he had once felt in himself. The nagging sense that all the success in the world couldn't fill the emptiness that came from chasing the wrong things. He had been there, standing in the same place, wondering what was next. "You know," David said, his voice steady but soft, "I think you're already on the right path. Realizing that something's missing is the first step." Michael sighed. "I don't know if I can leave it all behind, David. I've worked so hard for this life. The house, the car, the business. It feels like all of it is tied to who I am. If I step away from it, I'll lose everything." David thought for a moment, his mind drifting back to that conversation he'd had with Lucas and his mother. They had so little, Yet they had given him more than anyone with money or status ever had. It wasn't about the things you owned or the title you held. It was about what you gave to the world, and what the world gave back to you. You don't have to give up everything, David said finally, his voice calm but firm. But maybe you need to change how you look at it. It's not about running away from what you have. It's about finding what you're really passionate about. The things that make you feel alive. The things that make you connect with people. Start small. Focus on what really matters. Michael was quiet for a long moment. I don't know if I can do it, David. I'm scared. David smiled softly. I was too. But look at me now. I'm not sure where I'm headed, but I know this. I'm not going back to where I was. And you don't have to either. For the first time, Michael chuckled, though it sounded weary. I'm glad we talked, David. Maybe I do need to take a step back. You don't have to do it all at once, David reassured him. Just take it one day at a time. Start small, and let the rest follow. As they said their goodbyes, David felt a quiet sense of pride. He had done something that he hadn't been able to do for years. He had helped someone else take a step toward change. It wasn't about offering solutions or making grand gestures. It was about showing someone that it was okay to question their path, to make a shift, no matter how daunting it seemed. The next day, David stood in front of the community center, the soft morning light bathing everything in a golden glow. He was about to meet with a group of volunteers who had been working on a new project to provide educational resources to underprivileged children. It wasn't a glamorous project, but it was real, and it mattered. Just as he was about to head inside, he saw Lucas walking toward him. The boy had a backpack slung over his shoulder, and his face lit up when he saw David. "Hey, mister," Lucas called, waving energetically. David smiled. "Hey there, Lucas. How's it going?" "Great." Lucas grinned. "I was talking to my friends, and we were thinking it might be cool if we set up a little library in the park. You know, a place where kids can just come and read. We could get donations of books and start reading sessions on the weekends." David blinked, taken aback by the idea. "That's an amazing idea, Lucas. You're serious about this?" "Yeah, I think it could be really cool. You've always said we should do more for the community, so I want to help. I think we can do it." David's heart swelled with pride as he looked at the boy. It wasn't just that Lucas was trying to make a difference. It was that he believed at his core that he could. And that belief, that spark of hope, was the kind of thing David had once lacked. It was the very thing that could ignite change in the world. "You know what?" David said, his voice full of warmth. "Let's make it happen. I'll help you get started. I know a few people who might be able to donate some books, and I'll see if we can get some funding for supplies." Lucas's eyes widened in excitement. "You will? That's awesome, Mr. David." David chuckled. "You're not going to get rid of me that easily, Lucas. You've got a big vision, and I'm in. Let's get to work." As they headed inside together, David realized that this was it, the uncharted path he had been looking for. It wasn't about money or status. It wasn't about chasing something that wasn't meant to be his. It was about making a lasting impact, about helping others find their own path to something better. It was about doing the work, day by day, with no expectation of return. It was the kind of legacy that mattered. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he had found his true purpose. And in that moment, he knew there was no going back. He was right where he was meant to be. The ripple effect. The following months unfolded with a sense of purpose David had never experienced before. Every day felt like a new chapter in a story he wasn't entirely sure he was writing, but he was learning to trust the process. He continued to work with Lucas on the community library project, and together they managed to gather donations, set up a small reading nook in the local park, and even arranged volunteer-led storytime sessions for the children. What started as a simple idea had turned into a movement, something that was making a real difference in the neighborhood. David found himself spending more time in places he had never visited before, places he would have once considered beneath him. The local shelters, the schools, the homeless outreach programs, these were all now part of his world. And as strange as it felt at first, he began to realize that he was not only helping others, but he was being helped in return. His life, once defined by meetings, deals, and isolated moments of success, had expanded into something much more meaningful. But as the library project gained momentum, David's past also started catching up with him. It was a quiet reminder that no matter how much you change, your history would always have a way of resurfacing. One Tuesday afternoon, David was at the park with Lucas and a group of volunteers when he saw a sleek black car pull up. He didn't recognize it at first, but as the driver stepped out and made his way toward him, his heart sank. It was Richard Stone, a former business partner from his past, a man who had always been more interested in profit than people. "David," Richard greeted him with a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time." David stood up, his hands instinctively pushing down on his pants as if to straighten himself out. He'd never been one to show discomfort, but the sight of Richard stirred something inside him. Something old, something he hadn't fully reconciled with. "Richard," David replied, his voice measured. "What are you doing here?" Richard glanced around the park, his eyes narrowing at the children running around, and the volunteers setting up tables. It was clear he was out of his element. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. I hear you've been busy with the community stuff. Helping out the little people, huh?" David felt a sting in his chest, the familiar disdain in Richard's tone setting off a wave of old insecurities. He knew this kind of judgment, the kind that reduced everything to a financial equation. It was the same mindset that had driven him for years, until recently, until everything had changed. "This is important work, Richard," David said, his voice cool but firm. "We're making a difference here." Richard raised an eyebrow, his expression almost condescending. "Making a difference, or just trying to make yourself feel better about your life choices? I've seen how these things go. All this charity stuff, it's just a way to wash away the sins of the past, isn't it?" David's jaw clenched. He had heard that argument before, from people who thought their wealth and success were the only measures of worth. But today, it felt different. He wasn't that man anymore. "I'm not doing this for approval," David said, meeting Richard's gaze head-on. "And I'm not trying to wash anything away. What I'm doing matters. I don't need to explain it to you." For a moment, there was silence between them. Richard's eyes narrowed, and David could see the familiar flicker of disdain, but also something else, a flicker of confusion. Richard had known him as someone who thrived on power and control. He couldn't quite grasp the shift in David's priorities. "You're wasting your time," Richard said finally, shaking his head. "You were made for more than this. You don't need to be here with these people. You could be back in the boardroom, calling the shots, living the life you were meant to live." David took a deep breath, his heart steadying as he thought about the journey he had been on. He looked at Richard, at the empty promises behind his words, and felt a quiet sense of pride. "I've learned something in the last few months, Richard," David said, his voice steady. "It's not about the life you were meant to live. It's about the life you choose to make. And I choose this." Richard's face tightened, but David didn't look away. He had nothing more to say to him. His path was no longer tied to the world of boardrooms and stock tickers. His journey was now about real connections, about building something that would last beyond the next quarterly report. Richard paused, then shook his head as if dismissing David's words. "Well, I'm not going to stop you, David. But just know that when this all falls apart, and it will, you'll have no one to blame but yourself." David stood in silence, watching Richard get back into his car. There was no fire in his chest, no anger that followed the encounter. Instead, there was something else, something quiet and firm, like the weight of a decision that had already been made. As the car sped away, David felt the weight of Richard's judgment fall away, as though it had never been there at all. Later that week, after the encounter with Richard, David sat down with Lucas in the small library that they had set up in the park. It was a sunny afternoon, the trees casting long shadows across the grass, and a soft breeze carried the sound of laughter and voices around them. "Do you ever think about how much has changed, Lucas?" David asked as he watched the children gather around for the next storytime session. Lucas glanced up, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, last year, none of this was here. Now we got kids coming by every day to read. It's like, I don't know, like something's really happening. Like we're part of something bigger than just us." David smiled. "That's exactly it. We're part of something bigger." Lucas tilted his head, a curious glint in his eyes. "What do you think it is, though? What's the something bigger?" David paused, looking out at the children, their faces illuminated by the afternoon sun. For a moment, it was as if time slowed, and David felt as though he were seeing everything with new eyes. He thought about all the moments that had led him here. The tire on the side of the road, the conversation with Lucas's family, his own struggles to let go of his past, and he realized something profound. "It's about connection," David said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's about finding meaning in the little things, in helping each other, in being there for each other. That's the bigger part. That's the part that really matters." Lucas nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I get it. It's not about what we get. It's about what we give. And how we make people feel." David's heart swelled. The boy, so young, was already grasping something that many adults never truly understood. And that, David realized, was exactly why this project had to keep growing. Why he couldn't stop. He wasn't just changing his life. He was helping to change the lives of those around him. And for the first time in a long time, David understood that this was what it meant to truly live, to live with purpose, to live with kindness, to live for others. As the weeks went by, David began to see more and more people, friends, colleagues, even strangers, coming around, offering their help, their time, their resources. The library project expanded to other neighborhoods, and soon, a network of community-driven initiatives was taking shape. It wasn't just about books anymore. It was about fostering hope, about rebuilding trust in the things that really mattered. One evening, David found himself sitting in his living room, looking out the window. Clara was next to him, quietly flipping through a magazine, and the kids were upstairs, their laughter filling the air. "I never imagined this," David said, his voice soft. That one small act of kindness could turn into something so much bigger. Clara glanced at him, her expression warm and understanding. "You've come a long way, David. But I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be." David smiled, nodding slowly. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he no longer felt the pressure to control it. The journey ahead was full of uncertainty, but it was also full of possibility. And for the first time in his life, David was ready to embrace it, whatever came next.